Diff divergence is a method that we use in determining um, uh, line length divergence, I guess is the best way to identify it or refer to it as. Capital DIFF stands for difference, and it's referring to a difference, or what we refer to it as diff divergence, meaning that one line is different than another line, and that in itself is divergent. And so we use a factor of 3. For example, well, there's several different ways to calculate divergence, but we use a factor of 3 in that calculation. I got 2 examples that I'm going to show you, and they're obviously in this example here, we had a significant gap up. I guess I'll point that out here. We had a sky touch, trend red, crossover trend green. That's the 0 day. That was the day before the trend green. And then on the vertical, that was the day before the vertical green line. And then on the vertical green line, that's day 1 of the sky touch, red up above green. And then we had Zion in a different shape pattern, down, up, down, and the power 4 in a down, up, up pattern. And Zion is divergent in its shape with the power 4. That's basically what that means. The power Zion is actually in a right leg W higher pattern, but just for clarification, I wanted to use the direction, and it's a down, up, down pattern. One of the things that happens is swing pink crosses over green. That's one of the big signals for a gap up. That'll happen more than a guy thinks. But the diff divergent condition is basically here in the zip chart. And there are other lines to compare, but in this particular example, the day before the vertical green line, zip red was at 49.37 and zip gray was at 45.88. And that's just about $3.50 to $3.49, I guess. And the next day, or that difference between those 2 lines is, roughly $3.50. On the vertical green line day, we had zip red at 89.29 and zip gray at 63.29. So it was exactly $26 apart. And if you take the $26 and you divide it by the $3.50, you get 7.4 times. So the $3.50 times 7.4 equals your 26. So in other words, the factor, the X factor, was 7 times. And when we get 3 or greater, we assume that qualifies for diff divergence. And that method is basically taking the difference between the first point and the difference between the second point, the vertical green line, and those differences are, in this case, 7 times the spread. And so it's that big spread in a paired line. Zip red is a real fast indicator. Zip gray is its partner. It moves very fast, but not always as fast. In this other example I've got here, again, we have a big price up movement. It's a big green candle the next day, and it goes from an open of $11.30 to a closing of $13.50. So it's up about $2.25 for the day, which is pretty good for an $11 stock. The shape patterns were Zion was up, up, down, pink and blue were down, up, down, and yellow and white were 3 days down. And that divergence between Zion and the other power 4 lines, in this case they were 2 different groupings. Pink and blue were together and white and yellow were together like they normally are as pairs. The other thing was that swing Zion was up and swing Zion was down and swing pink was up. That's a classic divergent situation for a gap up. In this case here, we had a nice movement up, but it wasn't much of a gap. And then, of course, we had zip Zion low angle up, zip green low angle up. And so those are indicative of a next day up as well. That would be supporting evidence or extra evidence in our determination for a gap. One thing I'll also point out, if you need to spread these things apart, because if you spread this apart, you can see trend red is in a bottlenose pattern, which is a bottlenose down is a next day up pattern. And so if you're looking at it flat, you're not going to see that. And so you have that pattern in the trend chart. You also have the fact that trend gray is down touching pink. And then you have the difference in the shape patterns in the power chart. This is almost always the case. Keep in mind, the shape patterns can appear in other situations, but they don't have as many other pieces of supporting evidence, and you're not going to get the big movement up without those other pieces of supporting evidence. And so we end up with, I'll also point out that power yellow is lowest, indicating that that can be the start of an uptrend with the yellow twins. If you're familiar with the twins, it's zip yellow lowest and power yellow lowest, and when they're both going up, you're in an uptrend, and when they're both highest and going down, you're in a downtrend. And so in this particular case, both on the vertical green line, power yellow is lowest going down, and zip yellow is lowest and going down. And that's indicative. When it first shows up, when zip yellow first shows up and it's going down, it almost invariably goes up the next day. Not necessarily in a big movement like this, but typically it goes up the next day. And so now back to the diff part of this. The day before the vertical green line, zip red and zip gray were at 4.35. Both of them identical point difference, 4.35. Zip green was at, on the vertical green line day, zip red was at 12.5 and zip gray was at 6.25, exactly double one another. So you can say that from the day before the vertical green line, they were both at identical point, same point. One went up 50% and the other one went up 100%. Normally what we do is we calculate the difference on the day before, we calculate the difference between the two lines, and then we calculate the difference between the two lines on the next day, the vertical green line day, and then we'll divide that up to see if we have more than 3 times the difference. When we have an identical indicator, we obviously have 0, so that basically doesn't work. Although you could look at saying it's 0.1, and then the difference would be 6.25, which would make it 62 times higher, which qualifies more than 3. But the way it can also be done is the 435 on the day before the vertical green line, and it moved up to 625, and that's at $2, or roughly, or exactly, it's $1.90. But just if you round it up to $2, and then on the vertical green line day you have 625, or you have 1250 on the red, going down to the 435 the day before. That's a difference of 8. And so if you divide 8 by 2, you get 4, so that's 4x times, basically qualifying for more than 3, which then means that because it's greater than the 3x times that we typically think of as in a diff requirement, because it's greater than 3, it qualifies as a diff divergent condition. And that's basically because the spread between those lines was more than 3 times. And when you have that, then there's just some significant strength within the movement that's there. You may not exactly know what direction it's going. I mean, you oftentimes do not, based on the divergence. You can look at location. I mean, obviously, when swing pink is up and swing Zion is down, swing Zion is a price barometer, swing pink is a leading indicator telling us that the price is going to go up. And that's just amazing when you see a red candle on the vertical green line day. But it's telling us that the price is going to go up the next day, and swing Zion, which is a price barometer, along with zip pink and the 3 price lines, green, red, and blue, those 5 make up the price barometers. They always move with the price. Whichever way the price goes, that's the way they go. Swing Zion goes down, basically in a bottlenose pattern, and so because it's low, because it's way down there, the reaction for a gap was obviously be to go up. In this case here, it didn't gap. It closed on the vertical green line day of $11.10 and opened the next day at 11:30. So I guess it did go up 20 cents. That would be a little over, be close to 1%, 2%, I guess. Not quite 2%. So that's not a bad movement percentage-wise, and obviously gets a huge movement that next day with that big green candle that we see. But that's how you that's 2 different ways. The first way I calculated, I took the line difference of each of them from the day before to the vertical green line, and that difference then was divided to get our 3x or greater factor. And then the second way I did this was basically to take the difference between point A and point B, B meaning the vertical line day and A being the day before. So I took the A, which was 435, it went up to 635. That difference was 2. And then the red 2 differences from 12 to 4 was 8. So that was a 4x factor. And so we have more than 3. And that's the way we'll use it typically when you can do it either way. It really doesn't make any difference. But when the day before, when red and gray were identical numbers, there's no difference there. So then we use this other method. And you can use either one, but what it does is it's called DIFF divergence. And what it does is it recognizes a force or a strength within the movement that you might not typically see, but it's a divergent strength. And just think about what's happening. Zip red is just jumping up super fast, telling us that there's, a price movement going on, or that will go on. So that's in essence what DIFF divergence is about. That's a couple of different ways to calculate that, and recognize that it is a qualifying factor for when you're calculating divergent conditions or extra or supporting evidence conditions. Because when we're looking at when we're searching for gaps, and when we look at the identical indicators, we look at the down touches in the trend chart, and we look at the proximity group locations and patterns, the more pieces of divergent conditions that you can find, when you find the base patterns all qualifying, the 3 gap patterns have all qualified for a gap up, and when you find more supporting evidence, then that is indicative of creating a gap. And the more supporting evidence that you find, typically the bigger the gap is going to be. So that is DIFF divergence.